Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. Me and Inez are back after a 2 week hiatus. We were both traveling, and yeah, there's been some news on my end since we last talked. Um, and I want to say, I mean, Inez, the first thing I want to say is like I didn't know if anyone would like stick up for me. I thought some people would, but like you never know. And I think you were like one of the first. I think you weren't like, I couldn't imagine you like asking your boss if this was okay or anything like that. It was just like, yeah, this was in the past. It was bad. I don't defend the comments of the, I wrote in my previous life, and I don't defend them myself. I don't ask anyone else to. But you said, yeah, I mean, we should, judge me based on what I say today, and which we talk about in my last few years of writing. And just thanks. I mean, you behaved extremely honorably.
Well, I appreciate the thanks, but I don't know that it's necessary. I mean, I think this is just this is how we ought to behave. I think that there are serious. Actually, I mean, we can get into this in a minute, but I think it's very encouraging that the right seemingly has finally figured out the way that this game is played. And as many people online have pointed out, right, how many pundits, sort of mainstream pundits on the left, were Stalinists or Maoists, right, in their college years. I know I knew many college friends, who went in that direction when they were young, and none of them have to do apologia. None of them are in danger of being quote unquote canceled, right? And I really do think the last few attempts to cancel people on the right, whether it's you or Pedro or Nate Hockman, the fact that a lot of those seem to have failed is, I think, an important turning point. A lot of people say the end of cancel culture, and I think there's still very serious elements of that for people who don't have a platform. I think that the incentives, and I know you've written extensively about this with regard to the Civil Rights Act, but also with regard to corporate culture, right? So it's not that I think the problem is over, but I am encouraged by the fact that the rights finally seems to have figured out that it you really shouldn't, on the direction of places like HuffPo, um, short circuit the debate or have a conversation, or for that matter, deem certain people irrevocable or beyond the pale just because they at one point embraced some pretty radical ideas. Again, the left doesn't do that at all.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a spirit of just like really caring about ideas, like not saying this person should be like I don't write about one or two topics, right? It's not like I just write about race or I just write about political correctness. I write about a dozen different things. And like even if I had like terrible views today in like one area, like people should still be able to engage my ideas in others. And especially since this was 12, 15 years ago. I think that, yeah, people, knock on wood. We don't know. Anyone could have pressure. People could start downsing any moment. Like who knows? But so far, I think the people who knew me, who've appreciated my work before, they haven't given them what they wanted, and I'm very appreciative of that. Um, yeah, and there's the left has this terrible thing. I mean, have you been paying attention to Iglesias and how like he's like getting all trouble because he would sometimes interact with me, like we just reply to each other on like just not being friends, just like talking about issues.
Yeah, I've seen that, and actually, I mean, who knows what the actual impetus of this bring this up, 12, 15 years later actually was, but um, I that's my suspicion that actually, leaving Pedro aside for one moment, because I don't think he really falls into this category, but for you and Nate, I think both of you were people on the right getting published in the New York Times, right? Or you had some people who read your work who were in the center or on the left. And actually, I think that's the target of it, right? Nate Hockman had it. I don't know. I can't remember if the Atlantic actually ever ended up running something from him, but he was writing a long essay for the Atlantic when he was first canceled. Um, he had published that great essay that I really actually recommend everybody read on the post-religious right in the New York Times, and he was breaking into the mainstream, and not by doing it the David French way, right? Not by just constantly firing right and being the apologetic for, who hates conservatives more than the left. And so I don't think that part of it is an accident, and it wouldn't be surprising to me if the ultimate aim of writing that HuffPo piece was actually people like Iglesias and not you, right? Is
Interesting.
actually to make sure because you can survive this. But I don't know. What do you think? You think that the New York Times is ever going to publish you again after this?
I think it's doubtful. I mean, I think it was probably unlikely even before. Just I've had some Twitter mobs come after me, and so I thought it was unlikely before that I'd be in the New York Times again. So yeah, probably not. Whether that made me a target or not, I think that just my prominence, my growing prominence made me a target. I think they would have run it if they had this information on any conservative. They probably would have run it, and I'm sure that yeah, I don't know if they're that sophisticated because like this guy who wrote this piece, yeah, you're right. He does talk about the New York Times. He does talk about the Washington Post, but I think it would have been the same if all I'd ever written for was conservative uh, publications. I think these people are just sort of fanatics on these races. Like if somebody came to him with this scoop about Inez, or I don't know if anyone else who was similarly of prominence, I think they would have run with it. I don't think it was necessarily targeted based on I was reaching liberals or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, I'm basically the same in private as I am in public. So, I want to ask you something else about this whole experience, because a lot of times, when people, sort of move away from a past radicalism, right, they go and they flip onto the other side. So, I mean, here I'm thinking of even some good examples, like during the communist days, right? You have communist defectors who then became either libertarians or conservatives, either defected to the West, right? And there's a long tradition on the right of people coming. I'm thinking of David Horowitz, right? Coming red diaper babies, converting and coming over to the right. The entire neocon movement, right, was essentially former leftists leaving the left. I'm sure there are similar stories. I'm sure there are people who are brought up in an evangelical conservative culture who, you know, get angry with that culture or have a bad experience with it and flip to the left and then become fanatical in that way. And one of the reasons that we'll get to the apology part in a minute, but I want to ask because even in your apology, right, denounce you don't completely denounce some of the views that you hold. You're more moderated about them now. You're more circumspect and more mature about them, and you're not as radical. But it's not like you flipped from right to left. Like you didn't become a DEI. You didn't become a DEI professor. And I wonder if that's a better route out of radicalism. I guess I wonder which route because I've seen both, right? I've seen people who were once radical become just completely in the opposite direction, it seems like it would be a more widespread thing to just merely say, well, the forces I was reacting against, those were legitimate, and some of my ideas were legitimate. But I went too far down in this rabbit hole, and I forgot the countervailing influences. I forgot how actual human beings interact with each other, and I fell down into this intellectual hole. It seems to me more common, probably.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes it a little bit harder for me because, like, if you just go like complete polar opposite, they can say, "Oh, you really renounce your views." To these leftists, you see, my old writing and my new writing, and like you, and like what just appears in like the Federalist or like Fox News, there's no difference because if you're not a leftist on these issues, if you don't like completely deny, that there's racial differences in crime rates or whatever, and you're not trying to, use government to achieve uh, equal outcomes between groups, then you're just racist. You're against the whole project of multiracial democracy and civil rights and all these good things we've had since the 1960s. Um, and so, like, this is yeah, I think that these leftists, I think they're going to need to like first of all, they should be in touch with reality. Like they should just like accept that there are like statistical, differences in behavior between groups. The groups score different on test scores, and it's not because the tests are racist. Um, and like that, and I think this leads to radicalism when people see that like they're denying facts that they could see with their own eyes. They go in a bad direction, like I did, and just become sort of like inhumane and I would say illiberal and sort of just just against sort of treating people like individuals. I mean, that's a terrible thing to happen. Um, but yeah, you want to prevent people from going down that path and just saying like you're a Nazi or you're woke, you're some kind of DEI robot. That's not going to work for a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people are just going to go in terrible directions for that, and that's what we have to get past. I mean, this is why I think this is like this is the split on the left, like the ones who just want to, like, there's this guy named Dan Moynihan. He writes like a Substack. He's on Twitter, and he writes like some okay stuff, like about like, oh, government bureaucracy and paperwork and like how we should get rid of that. I'm like, okay, I read him. He seems like a reasonable guy, but he's like, oh, I always knew this about Richard Hanania, and all his evidence was because I had an interaction with him once where I said like, women are less pro free speech than men, literally just that, right? And it's just like he sees no difference between that and like the worst kind of racism and the worst kind of misogyny in the world. And so like, how do we even like talk to these people? I don't know. It's really sad, like how sort of their minds are corrupted on these issues, and it just makes sort of understanding across ideological lines. It just makes it so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the pithy ways I've formulated this in my own head when I'm thinking about the lack of any kind of nuance and in discussion of, for example, racial issues or differences between the sexes, is that I think a large part of the left now no longer sees any material difference between the views of the average boy who landed on Omaha Beach, right, and Adolf Hitler. And if your worldview compresses the two sides of World War II, um, into a single ideology, then you are simply not looking at the world. I wanted to write this piece way back when I was um, like just starting to write for the Federalist. This is probably 2017. And my husband convinced me not to write it. He's like, there's no way that this is going to, this is going to get you canceled if you write it just by the headline, even though what I was going to write was, of course, quite nuanced. But I think it's actually an important idea. Maybe some point I will write it. But is there's this idea that racism is the worst thing that a human being can do to another human being. Um, and that doesn't mean that racism, quote unquote, isn't bad, right? But the reason that we find it, the reason that we do have, I think legitimately have some worries about that kind of tribalism is because it has led to much worse things that human beings can do to each other, but it's far from the only thing that's led people to kill each other, right? Like it's and there's no separation between the natural tribalism of human beings, of which I would say America is remarkably on the low end of the scale. I mean, if you go basically anywhere else, including, of course, European countries, you'll find much more of that kind of ethnic tribalism than you will in the United States, because we are a multi-ethnic country, because people actually are, and I think because we have this legacy of sort of what is it, like almost like a trade society, right? Where we almost like Venice maybe back in the day, right, where we have people from all over the world exchanging goods and services, and there are problems with that. I think there are hard. Some of them are laid out in Othello, right? But there are problems to that kind of society, but there are also advantages. And one of them is that Americans are remarkably sort of charitable towards people with different customs from themselves, or different religions, different ethnic backgrounds. But you go around the world and that's not the case. And to equate that kind of ethnic tribalism, which again has its own problems, immediately with genocide and Hitler, is again a compression of. That's why I use the example of the kid landing on Omaha Beach, who probably, a lot of them were probably fine with even legal segregation, right? But the idea of equating that with Nazism is itself such a anti-intellectual and anti-reality project, that I don't know. I think the whole thing is, obviously we're not going to have a good faith discussion about any of these things, and I do think that not having that good faith discussion about some obvious facts like racial differences in crime, if the only, and I think the same thing on sex differences, right? If the only person saying certain obviously true things in the popular square is Andrew Tate, is that his name? Andrew Tate?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I know the last part, Tate. But is Andrew Tate, right? Then that's going to attract a lot of people to his position, because they'll recognize the truth in what he's saying. But then he'll add on a bunch of other things that are probably extreme and unnecessary onto that. To my mind, the best way to bring people back from that is to start aggressively saying the obviously true things and for the mainstream right to start to say the aggressively, obviously true things.
Yeah, there was this incredible essay. I mean, just I agree with all that, and but it was like the a polar opposite of what you're saying. It's by this guy. I think his name is John Gans, Ganz. Have you ever seen this guy?
I think so. I think
He's a
I've
he's like
interacted
this,
with him on Twitter or
yeah, he's like
something.
this academic leftist who's just very, very left wing, standard left wing. And he had a Substack that said like I was actually worse now than my past because before I was just like racist, but now like because I accept like statistical differences, the racism is more brutal. It's like an ideology now instead of just like something more innocent, which is just like disliking other people. And I'm just like this guy's, I used to read him and I think he's like so sort of smart, and it's just like dude, like you have this just sort of religious objection to like facing certain facts, and how can we reach these people? Like these people who seem intelligent, who I think they want to do the right thing. I think they're well intentioned. Maybe you don't think that. But I think in their own minds they think they're making a better world, and people like us are just bigoted and irrational and just believe these things because I don't know, we're bad and we want to believe them. Um, yeah, how do we reach those people?
Well, I think it depends on the person whether it's possible, but I do think that it takes an enormous amount of mental energy to deny truths in front of your face. And I do think, I mean, this is a bit pop psych of me, but I do think it's just there's an enormous amount of mental energy, just like with the trans issue, that goes into denying things that people immediately can see are false. Um, and so I think people become fanatical about silencing anybody who obviously observes something that is directly around them. Um, but I do think that is a breeding ground for certain kind of radicalism. And honestly, there's another part of this, which is just, again, when did we lose sight of the fact that 21-year-olds are inclined towards radicalism? I mean, this is something that has been understood for a long time, and we used to make jokes about it, right? I mean, the whole stereotype of the philosophy undergrad, right, sitting around like smoking a joint, talking about like, radical ideas on the left, on the right. Like I said, I certainly had a bunch of communist friends in high school and college. I mean, and some of them never grew out of it, and a lot of them did, right? Because they had more experiences in the world and they developed a certain amount of nuance. And most of them, by the way, again, did not flip into being conservatives. They just, they came away from some of the most radical or violent and outright violent, ideas that they had, and they came away from those ideas. When did we stop recognizing that that's I mean, I think that's kind of natural, especially in a society that has so aggressively suppressed, I think, particularly young men from any sort of chance of glory or purpose. Or I just, it seems very predictable to me that people would find these kinds of ideologies attractive. One only hopes that they become more nuanced over time, that they meet more people, that, for example, on the misogyny track, right? Like they find a woman to
I
share their
learned
life
that
with.
you
And
women can behave honorably in politics, as you showed me.
I don't, I just, not even in politics. I'm just talking about like in person or personal interactions, right? Some of us, I wonder how much of it is atomization as well. That I think the left likes to frame it as incels in their basement. I don't think that's quite true. I mean, I think all of us, and particularly the younger you are, we have fewer in-person friendships, fewer in-person interactions, fewer family relationships that are permanent and loving, right? So, for example, I have wondered a lot recently how many young women don't have any. I think we talked about this last time, but don't have any interactions with men that are deep and long lasting and loving, right? Whether that's sexual or not, it could be your father or your brother, but fewer women have a father around, there are fewer siblings, period. So fewer women have brothers, right? Fewer women have sons because of the declining birth rate. Fewer women have husbands because of the declining marriage rate. And I can see how that funnels people into one of two directions, right? On the one hand, you can decide the people that you're not interacting with are exactly the same as you in a kind of psychological projection, right? And then therefore get angry when they're not. When men don't behave as women, or don't, behave especially emotionally as women, now that's, pegged as like almost abusive, like the men don't go to therapy meme, right? If they don't behave like women, they are evil. And then on the other hand, you can see just diving deep into, like, these are alien creatures, that we have nothing in common as
Yeah.
men and women in our humanity at all, and we're just wholly alien beings with no way to actually connect with each other's experiences or feelings or visions of
Or like this
reality.
crude Marxism where we're like, just we have antagonistic interests, right? And like, men have to conquer or women have to conquer, right? That also is like something people latch on to. Do you,
Yeah, Simone
so
de Beauvoir famously said that women are the most oppressed class in all of history, because unlike any other oppressed class, so if she uses the examples of Jews and blacks, she said at least theoretically you can imagine either completely separating from your oppressors and moving away, or you can imagine killing them all and with an end to your oppression. But women are the only ones who are tied to their oppressors. She thought this made women particularly oppressed. I would argue, of course, that it's one of the many reasons why this oppressor oppressed lens makes absolutely no
right,
sense to discuss
yeah,
women and men, whether today or frankly 300 years ago as well. It just doesn't. It's not the correct frame of reference to talk about interdependent, you know, sexes.
yeah, right. And and this is why I think that the racialism is also bad too, because like, look, we all benefit, for example, from if you can separate different races, in the way you can't with the sexes. But like, if the best person gets a job and they invent a cure for cancer, right, or they invent some kind of product that we all use, that's better for all of us. You want to be the most discriminated against group in a rich society more than you want to be the most privileged group in a poor society, right? I mean, the fact that we live in America, we live in a first world country, we should be extremely grateful for that, and we should be thinking about ways to make everybody better off. It's not like there's like affirmative action and stuff, like, okay, but like most of life is not zero sum. It's not like a black guy doing well or a white person doing well harms people of the other race. So yeah, I just we just really need to get beyond that. So you wanted to, so like, yeah, we'll move on to like other stuff besides the recent news. You said you wanted to ask something about the apologies, and like how, uh, like whether they work or anything. So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've written an essay about this, about not apologizing, and then you did, and I think I had very much the same opinion as you. I thought that apologies um, into a hostile mob essentially are not appreciated. They just put blood in the water, and they don't help. Um, but and your apology is half apology and half not, in the sense that it's a genuine repudiation of your former views, but you also double down on some of your other crime think views even within the apology, right? So I'm wondering, um, have we turned a corner on being able to talk about this in a more nuanced way? And because of that, or related to that, and perhaps unrelated, what is the status of apologizing? What is the status of being canceled and apologizing now? Because it seems to me that your apology actually really helped you. Whereas in previous cases of cancellation, it has always put blood in the water. And I would actually put Pedro a little bit more in your camp as well, because he denounced his former views and said, I no longer believe these things. But it wasn't a full, bending of the knee either. Obviously, he's still a very right wing guy.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I was thinking, when I wrote that paper and the examples I used, they were examples where people either were saying something that was arguably true or like their real opinion, right? So, there's like, this was back in 2015, I think this was published. The idea, like most of the stuff that, people were getting in trouble for was not, objectively that bad, or at least from my perspective, wasn't objectively that bad. I do think like in my case, like, it's not about like making the HuffPost happy. I know they wish the worst for me. I know I'm not gonna make them happy. It's like I have to be honest with people. Like I can't say that like, even if it helped me, like if you told me it would help me to sit there and say, oh, I did nothing wrong, it probably would have with like many right wingers. Many right wingers on Twitter were upset with me. Um, but it's like I can't be honest with my audience. I cringe. I read that stuff and I'm like, I'm embarrassed. I'm like, wow, I really sucked. And I can't just like it would be just completely dishonest to go through life telling my readers, no, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think that. So like I have to just tell the truth. And so like, you have to tell the truth if that's what you believe. Whether it helped me, yeah, I think so. I think it gave people permission. Like if I didn't say anything, I think it could have given people the impression that those are still my views, and that's very hard to defend, right? If I make clear that those are not my views, then there's an opportunity for people to say, look, he made a mistake and he was stupid. But this is not something to like unperson somebody for, especially since it was a long time ago and now he believes different things. Um, and so yeah, I think that it really depends on the situation and it depends on what your goals are. I think just like giving into a mob is a bad move. At the same time, like like honesty is sort of my brand, and I just couldn't lie to people. I wouldn't be me if I like pretended like that was okay because I don't like those views. I cringe at the writing, I cringe at the ideas, and I cringe at the communication style and the trolling and the joking. I just hate it, and so that overcame everything else. Like people just really need to know that.
Um, I mean, what happened to argument? So the other aspect of this that really bothers me, and the reason that I guess I've defended a series of people who have been canceled at this point, um, I really don't like this idea that you kind of said it in when we first started talking at the beginning of this podcast, which is that just because you're willing to have a conversation with somebody, you're now you've endorsed all of their ideas, or because you agree with somebody on some aspect that you therefore agree. I mean, obviously, you and I, the previous shows will attest, like you and I disagree on a lot in terms of political worldview, right? And not just the stuff you were canceled for, just across the board, right? Um, and I really don't like this politics of sort of association and purity. That even if you think someone said some really heinous things on one topic, that means they couldn't have a good point somewhere else. I mean, because I've been asked sometimes, so you know, uh, if what happens to you, how would you respond if, like, if they come after me, for example, for like, for having a podcast with you, or for retweeting somebody or whatever who has had somewhere else has said something awful, and I just think that's an impossible standard, and it's very damaging, not just to, I hate this word, but the discourse, but to argument, to any ability to actually suss out ideas. And by the way, it's not a standard that's applied to anyone else in society, because like, are we at the end point of this would be to say, well, okay, well, if you're a vegetarian, you agree with what Hitler said, right? Actually, I recently got some trolls on Twitter telling me that I was agreeing with Hitler because said that there were two distinct biological sexes and that they
Well,
weren't
Hitler
immutable.
did think that, to be
Well,
fair.
yes, Hitler did think that. You know, who else thought that? Everyone, virtually
Everyone.
everyone in human history. And again, it's a way of cheapening what a real, for example, genocidal uh, views and rhetoric are. And if you collapse all of those things, plus you have this association, what you get are a lot of people, even on the right, who are unable to have an honest conversation with anyone, because as soon as somebody observes something that's outside of their Overton window, the entire discussion shuts down and it becomes a question of separating yourself from the bad person, right? And denouncing it. And not only is that, you can't run a political movement that way, you'll never get anywhere. But even aside from the pragmatic aspect of it, it's so anti-intellectual, it's so flattening to the ways in which we can actually challenge each other's ideas and like refine our own ideas. It just, I used to read Chateau Artiste a ton when I was back in 2015, which, by the way, I was so naive. I think I said this. I would have it sent to my law school
Yeah.
edu address,
Yeah,
right? So
we
I
were
have
all
I have
naive.
it
Yeah.
archived. Yeah.
Yeah.
I learned a lot from that blog. I thought he had a lot of good points. Did he also have some terrible points? Sure. were there offensive things on there? Sure, but I learned a lot. I think I sharpened a lot of my own views about sex differences, which are not exactly the same as his, right? But why should we be afraid to read something that is maybe way beyond the pale to us? But then the worst case is it's going to sharpen how you think or how you debate somebody. I don't know. I
Well,
really don't like those two
Iglesias was
aspects.
saying this to his followers. I mean, Iglesias is really, I mean, being, I think he was being heroic here. I mean, he goes, look, he goes, I think Haddad is racist. Okay, fine, he thinks that. He's a liberal. But you know what? Like a lot of conservatives have problematic views on race. Like from the perspective of his audience, you're also racist, and like everyone you know and talk to is pretty much racist. And so, like, he's like, how are we ever going to talk to them about anything? If that's the standard. And yeah, I mean, they just have this culture of like, no, you can't. It's amazing. I mean, it was like 4 days. Like we never. And Iglesias is like, look, I'm not, friends with him. He doesn't hang out at my house all the time. He's like, I wouldn't invite him for dinner. I'm like, I'd go out for dinner with Iglesias, but like he has to like say this stuff, and then it's like just the talking gets to them. Yeah, they really are. I mean, I think this is going to break down. I think this is a position of privilege, right? Back when they controlled Twitter and when they controlled the discourse, they could sit there and they could say, okay, this person is bad. Stefan Molyneux, we're just going to get rid of them, right? We're going to cancel them. They're not going to be on Twitter anymore, and they're going to be removed from the discourse. I think they're going to be going through a period where, like, now Elon Musk owns Twitter, and a lot of these right wing voices and even some crazy people are getting boosted. Um, maybe they'll maintain their privileges within like the media and certain institutions, but I think that privilege is sort of crumbling. And I think we're going to get to a point where they're just going to be, because of the sort of the power sort of disparity between liberals and conservative. It's getting shuffled a little bit. I think you're going to see less of that, maybe by necessity. What do you think? Do you think that sounds reasonable?
Well, I think I was going to ask you the same thing, which is, do you think that this is at least the beginning of the end of this? I don't know if I'd put it quite as optimistically as you did, but I do think maybe that the right is coming to this understanding, as I said at the beginning of the pod, because that would change the dynamic of this kind of cancellation attempt. Um, if people could find a home on the right, after they had been canceled, because maybe that accelerates a sort of bifurcated country. I mean, I think a lot of things are trending that direction now, but I think it'd be an enormous improvement if the right didn't join in on the circular firing squad every time, basically on marching orders from the left. Um, and again, it's not like you have to agree with or even stay silent. I don't like the idea that people have to stay silent if they hear something from somebody who's quote unquote on their team that they viscerally disagree with. But you attack the ideas. You don't exile the person, right? You just launch an argument against the ideas, like when when I was talking about Sound of Freedom, right? Like I
Or
got a
did you
lot of
make fun of
pushback
did you
from
make fun of
people.
Sound and Freedom?
Yeah, I got a lot of pushback from people because I really disliked this movie. I thought it was really, really bad. And I there was a write up about it in I Am 1776, which is a pretty far right journal, with some really great essays. But so one of these write ups referred to my remarks, but it was like, I really disagree with this idea. I'm purposely making it the Queen's English here, but I really disagree with these ideas. But there's no personal attack. There's no attempt to like exile somebody, and I think it's just perfectly fine. I'm not silent about people with whom I disagree just because they happen to be on the right. But there has to be some middle ground, and I'm wondering if the right really understands that they can separate ideas from this full on exiling of a person, like in a way that really does remind me, by the way, of kind of late Soviet era. Um, because I'm sure the gulags after Stalinism were in relatively low use. All right, you had to be like really aggressive to end up in the gulag, and it was more than enough for the institutions to just blackball you. Right, if you didn't have a party card or you weren't in good standing with the party, then you wouldn't be able to get a job, or you'd only be able to get a job off the books, washing dishes, and all of your friends and family wouldn't be able to associate with you because then their kids wouldn't be able to get into university, right? Those kinds of things, I think, are not that far off from the way that our culture was operating until recently. And I'm wondering if you think that that actually is changing, because it seems like Pedro, I don't think is like blackballed from the right. You, I don't think are going to be blackballed from the right. Nate, I don't think is going to be blackballed from the right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's crazier than that. Nick Fuentes is hanging out with like congressmen. I mean, you see, like Paul Gosar was like speaking at like Nick Fuentes's event or something like that. And as far as I know, these congressmen don't announce them. So I think we really are in a new world. I think the polarization is such that like something like Huffington Post has no has no sort of, credibility to be telling people how they should think about different issues to the right. So yeah, I think the battle of, there's another guy named Scott Greer, who was canceled. He was writing for Daily Caller and he was on Fox News. He had a, book called No Country for White Men, and he was canceled at around 2018 or 2017. And yeah, it would be completely different today. I mean, they could say, he had some racist writings in his past. There, he wrote for some racist publications. Therefore, that's it. He was just, sort of excluded from everything in conservatism. I mean, part of it is just like there's a market on the right. So like, let's say like Fox News didn't like me or they didn't like you, right? There's podcasts now and like, YouTube stars who have bigger audiences than Fox News, right? You could go on like Tim Pool or something, right? And these are like huge, you know, uh, outlets, and the left could strangle that if they had Twitter, if they had social media, right? But you have Substack now and you have Twitter, unfortunately fighting with each other. I wish they would be working closely together, but you have Twitter and you have Substack, both, unapologetically pro free speech, big, um, big distributors of ideas. And with that, yeah, we're in a different world. We are. I mean, if on the cancel culture, on free speech, I don't know what things are going to be like in 5, 10 years. Oh my God. I think in 2018 to 2020, somewhere point, you could have thought that we were entering a new dark era, right? It was just going to be like these payment processors would shut off everyone who had a dissenting view. Google would deperson you. YouTube would deperson you. Maybe we were headed to that. Maybe we were just lucky that Elon Musk bought Twitter, right? But I think Musk buying Twitter, and I think just like the greater sort of choices of like things out there. And then the left just overreached. I mean, the left just overreached, and they caused a backlash on the right. They started calling everyone racist, and so like it was sort of the boy who cried wolf. So yeah, I'm optimistic. We're gonna get to a better place. I am personally like God is watching over me, because if this happened in 2017, 2018, it would have been different from 2023.
Yeah,
I
that was my
really
next question. If you think how different you think this would have been if this had been released in 2017. I think you would have been done. I feel bad for Jason Richwine, whose biggest
that's
crime
nothing. Yeah, yeah,
whose
yeah.
biggest crime was writing something about race and IQ in undergrad, right? I think it was his
I think
undergrad
it might have been his
thesis,
PhD. It might have been his PhD thesis,
maybe,
but yeah, it
but
was his
he was
it was
before he was even working.
yeah.
And he got blackballed pretty
Poor
effectively.
Jason.
But
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right that I'm not as optimistic as you are, because there's still such a thing as institutional power here, and I'm not sure that it's that easy to break, because you have huge differences. Although there's a caveat to that I'll get to, but huge differences between generations. Where every year at the bottom you have essentially cultural revolutionaries being added. So even I think what we're seeing are the Gen X essentially defectors. Like Elon Musk is for me the quintessential Gen X defector. I think folks like Barry Weiss are as well in their own ways. They're these sort of either apolitical or center left folks in these institutions who at one point just looked around themselves and said, "This is ridiculous. This is getting way too ridiculous, right?" But what sounds ridiculous does not sound ridiculous to a lot of people under the age of 30, right? Who have really imbibed this from a very young age. It's the world that they've grown up in. It's more importantly the world that rewards them with incentives for behaving in that way, like very concrete ones, both honors and financial. Um, but I do think the power of those institutions is brittle. I think it's quite pervasive, but it's brittle because the total collapse in trust in virtually every American institution, from you know obviously public health institutions over the pandemic, but every branch of government, every agency, the media, big business, right, social or tech companies. I mean, the trust and support for any of those institutional things has been plummeting off a cliff. Higher ed, universities, right? Um, and that has to have a consequence at some point. And it seems like those institutions are very dedicated, perhaps because they feel the pressure from below, from their workers, um, very dedicated to sort of squeezing harder and harder on a diminishing and more brittle source of credibility to the point where people just stop paying attention altogether. And I do wonder if we're at that point where at least the right is truly in their hearts, like just giving up on caring what these institutions say or think, because I think that'd be a very positive development.
Well, I think we're. I mean, I think we're there. I mean, look, under 30, like this idea is, cancel. I mean, liberals are writing all these think pieces about, how they're reading, BAP or this Fuentes. I mean, they're really. I mean, I think the younger generation. I mean, I think cancellation is. You're right that like maybe the under 30s of like liberals and mainstream institutions um, are probably worse than their elders. But young conservatives are better. And then like what the next generation is going to be like. That's what sort of the battle is now. I mean, this is why, Rufo and the work he's doing, this is why, we're focusing on civil rights law. This is why free speech and Elon Musk's Twitter are worth worrying about. It's not just set in stone what the next generation is going to believe. The next generation is always being shaped by exactly what people like me and you and people more important than us are doing. So yeah, I think that those are two things. It's never a complete victory. It's always like, what is that? What is that saying? That like, every like liberty, I don't know, something about like liberty is always one generation away from being lost. That's always true. But I'm overall optimistic.
I will say I've been more optimistic lately. I've just seen how little pressure. And actually, this is maybe moving away from the the Richard cancellation show. How companies and how even universities have reacted to, for example, the affirmative action ruling has been more. It's been easier to push them than I thought it would be. I thought it would be like trench warfare all the way, like needs to be constantly enforced. And that may still turn out to be true, but what we're seeing are private companies dropping their DEI programs because they're afraid of getting sued, right? What we're seeing are major law firms, according to Aaron Sabarium, right? Telling their corporate clients, you need to be careful about your hiring practices now from the opposite direction, not only afraid of the EEOC, but actually afraid that the Supreme Court means what it says, that racial preferences are unconstitutional. So, I mean, I've been encouraged. Or there was a recent story just a couple days ago about the S&P dropping their ESG as part of their credit rating, right?
Oh, really? I hadn't seen
Yeah.
this. That's interesting.
So, I mean, these are big institutions. Now, maybe they'll reconstitute these ideas in new forms, and we always have to watch for that. I mean, one of the earliest sort of political battles I participated in was over Common Core, and that's really how we lost Common Core. Was we made it politically toxic to say Common Core, and that was a victory. But then the exact same laws and ideas were essentially instituted in something like 40 something states, it was just under different names, right? College and career readiness was a kind of phrase, but so we sort of won the rhetorical battle, but we lost the substantive war, and maybe that'll be the case. Like maybe a lot of these programs will reconstitute, but it has been encouraging to me to see that these institutions actually can be pushed, whether by legislation, by court decisions, by just pure backlash, a la Bud Light. These institutions can be pushed in the correct direction.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. Yeah, so yeah, that was a lot there. Yeah, let's move on. I want to talk about one more thing you mentioned. There was this Obama article in Tablet, and I wish I'd read the whole thing. I only read the parts about gay sex. I mean, I don't know what that says about me, but there was a part about Obama having fantasies about having sex with men, and I saw that, and I tweeted that, and a lot of people paid attention to it. But you're telling me that the article itself is actually very interesting, so I'll have to read it after this. But explain to me sort of what's in there and what you found interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth it. It's very long, but it is worth it. I think that the couple important takeaways that I saw, other than the gay sex fantasies, also the rehashing of a story that Obama had told in his own memoirs. It turns out to be almost certainly completely fabricated, about why he broke up with his white girlfriend of many years. Somebody actually did the journalistic work of going to talk to her, which seems like an obvious step that should have happened a decade ago. But nevertheless, somebody went to go talk to her, and she, of course, pointed out that actually their disagreements were about his endorsement, or at least acceptance, of anti-Semitism via Reverend Wright, Minister Farrakhan style Black politics. And that's really was the barrier between them. But leaving aside Obama's personal life for a moment, um, the two big takeaways I came away with, one is about the way Obama has been remembered, I guess, in the popular imagination, and the other one about who's running the government today. So the first one about his legacy is that there is a lot in here that points to how I really remember Obama, which was as one of the first um, national figures to really put some of this extremely um, like hostile racial rhetoric into the world, and from a position that it had not previously attained. Like this 1968 ideas that I think Chris Rufo chronicles really well in his book Cultural Revolution. I think Obama was in many ways the first president to really buy into a lot of his worldview very much syncs with, but he's simply much better at giving a sort of moderate sounding gloss to it than many of its proponents today. But in essence, and in the way he governed, I think he was very much of this camp. And then also, of course, the idea that there were no scandals under his watch except the tan suit or whatever. That's just like a straight up piece of propaganda, from gun running across the border to what the most important foreshadowing aspect, I think, for me, the scandal of his administration was that the IRS was politically targeting his opponents and politically targeting Tea Party groups. And Lois Lerner faced absolutely no consequences for that. So that's all a reminder of who Obama actually is, and what role his presidency actually played in the history of our country. But then in terms of the modern politics, it seems that he is, first of all, he broke precedent at the time, not leaving Washington, D.C. They said at the time that it was so that their daughters could complete their education in Sidwell Friends, which is a very fancy private school in Washington, D.C. But of course, the Obama daughters have long left the nest, and the Obamas are still in Washington, D.C., which is a departure again from precedent, in terms of because we think that the peaceful transfer of power requires that the previous guy really fully take himself out of the political
I've
system.
never heard that. I'm sorry, Inez, but I've never heard this theory that the previous president should actually leave Washington. I'm sure most of them do, just because they don't live in Washington. But I've never heard this as a norm until
It
right
was
now.
a norm, at least in modern politics. I can't pretend to know or
Well,
have
people
researched
left.
it
Does that
going
mean it was
back
a
in
norm because?
time, but
But was that just because? I mean, they happened to just leave Washington D.C. I mean,
no,
it
it
doesn't
was.
mean that.
I mean, it was talked about at the time, like that, and that's also the norm. I mean, these are genuinely norms and not, for example, constitutional prohibitions. But for example, the norm that the former president, doesn't comment on current political, like that was a norm
Yeah.
all the way
No,
through. I mean, Reagan
that
removed
one is right.
himself,
Yeah,
but
that one I've
those
heard that
were
one before.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, those were of a piece. Those two, like, we're going to leave. He's going to leave Washington D.C. He's not going to comment.
I think you could physically be in Washington. I don't know if that. Okay, well, go ahead. But go ahead. Are you gonna go
Anyway,
ahead?
it was a norm, whether it's the right norm, whatever, it was broken. And you could think, oh, again, he had this like sort of apolitical reason that he gave the press. By the way, the evidence that it was a norm is that he was asked about it by the press. And he gave this very apolitical reason. My daughters need to finish school. Very understandable, right? No need to uproot my daughters from their school. But again, that excuse ran out a long time ago. And according to this article, there are a lot of senior officials um, who have current high positions. They were working for Obama in his administration. They have current high positions now. He's having people at these salons in his house in Calorama, right? And there have been obviously questions about, because of Joe Biden's obvious limitations and decline in terms of, even if we don't take the worst case scenario, in terms of his mental decline, he's obviously like very limited in how much energy in any given day he can expend in running the government. And I've always said, oh, who's running the government? I mean, the same people who have always been running the government in recent decades, which is the administrative state, without much oversight at all. But this article at least heavily hints at the possibility that what's actually happening is that both under the Trump administration and in the current one, a lot of the administrative state is really taking direction, or at least very strong advice from Barack Obama.
Really?
Yeah,
There's what would that? There's evidence of this
yeah,
in the
just that,
piece.
just these meetings at his house. There's hard to say. Uh, it hints heavily at it. It's the sort of thing that if we had a reasonable press corps, they might be concerned about. It'd be very easy to stake out the Obama's house, and see who is arriving and leaving from that house at what time, in correspondence with what policies. Right. This is the sort of investigative journalism that one might imagine a young gumshoe might be up to, if we had a fourth estate, but we don't. I'm not saying this is definitively true, and also it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be like sort of incredibly nefarious pulling strings sort of situation. He is the senior member of the Democratic Party. He's still heavily involved in the Democratic Party. All of these high ranking officials used to work for him. The president is obviously in decline, and it seems like it would actually be somewhat natural on a human level for a lot of people to seek advice from their former boss in this way. But it is, look, that is not how our government is supposed to function, right? We weren't supposed to give Barack Obama a third term. Joe Biden ran.
Yeah.
So
The I'll read this piece, but so I mean, are you bothered by Trump, like his influence over Republicans in Congress? I mean, he's endorsing some people and not others. I mean, he seems more clearly a major figure in the Republican politics than Obama is in Democratic, unless he's really, Obama's really running the government. Does that bother you at all?
no, because he's actively running for president. He's not termed out, right? He lost an election and he wants to come back.
You think
He
when
doesn't
Trump
admit.
when Trump gets
Right.
turned out, he's gonna be hands off and not comment and
I
not
mean,
do anything?
I doubt it, but but as of now, no, it doesn't bother me. He's the leading candidate for the nomination. He's obviously seeking office again. So I think it's a very different situation. He's not termed out, but as I said, Reagan, Bush Senior, Bush Junior, they all stepped away from politics. Clinton, even to some degree, did, although through his wife, of course. I guess you got to imagine how separate are the political interests of Hillary and Bill Clinton. I don't know the answer to that. But it has been the tradition for presidents, once they're termed out, to step out, exactly because they're incapable of being held responsible democratically, right? It's not, that's not a small d democratic system. If you have people who will never even have the option to stand for election, making major policy and political decisions for the country, that's anti-democratic.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we'll link to the Obama piece.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing. Just my recommendation is the sort of thing that you can read for 20 minutes and then maybe put it aside and then read another section. It's very long. It's at least a 30-40 minute read, maybe depending on how fast you read, maybe it's like 60-minute read. So I would treat it as like a short book almost, and it's a very, very interesting interview. I think it is very revealing, both personally and politically, about Obama and about our system. I
Yeah.
think it's well worth reading.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, we have a couple minutes left. Let's see if we could just sneak in something about the 2024 election, since we've been away for a little while. What do you think about DeSantis? What do you think about him finally saying, sort of half-heartedly, but then when pushed on it a little bit more forcefully, that Trump lost the 2020 election? And just what are your thoughts on the DeSantis campaign more generally? Last polls I've seen, it's not looking good.
So I'll leave the campaign stuff aside for a moment, because I really just don't see why anyone would seek my advice on political campaigns. But in terms of answering the question about the election, I think it's being played in left-wing media very, very differently than what I hear when I listen to that interview, which is that DeSantis is laying out the case for um, the very clear ways in which the election of 2020 was not a clean election. And I think that those are varied and serious. The changes to voting rules, in some cases, not going through the legislature, right, during COVID, major changes to those rules, laying out the censorship of a major story, dropping it off the New York Times, sorry, not the New York Post story about Hunter's laptop, right? Talking about a variety of other, like, both legal, and then also talking about the ways in which it's difficult to actually prove fraud through the courts. You have to actually get those cases in on the merits before you can introduce a lot of evidence. Anyway, I thought he gave a very good answer on the ways in which you could consider this election to be unfair. But then he separated those from, for example, the theory about the Dominion machines, or some of these other
Did he
theories that
talk about that?
don't have a lot of evidence.
Maybe I didn't see the full clip. He talked about the voting machines and all that other stuff
Well,
being
he basically
nonsense.
said that part, if you're asking about that, do I think that machines change the vote totals? No. If you're asking, do I think this election was conducted with the standards that, for example, the 2016 or 2000 election were conducted under, the answer is no. So I actually thought he answered that question really well. And then the headline in the media was, Biden won, or DeSantis admits Biden won 2020, which the entire way of framing that question, right, is inherently sort of in bad faith, right? So obviously Biden won, he's sitting in the office. You can question the structure of the election and ask, did that affect the outcome? But there's no way for us to know. You can suspect that it affected the outcome, but there's not really a way for us to answer that question. Anyway, I thought he answered the question with a lot of nuance, and well, actually, and that the headline didn't reflect what he said, because they're obviously just trying to, like, make sure that he ticks off the Trump voters, and then to ding Trump at the same time. They had their own reasons for writing headlines that way, but I would encourage people to actually watch the full exchange. So on that, I think I'm very much in the DeSantis camp. In terms of his chances in the election, look, nobody's cast a ballot yet. There's a long way to go, but it certainly seems like he has less of a chance of winning now than he did when he jumped into the race, and that's never a good thing for a campaign.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think the way you described his answer, I think is fair, and I think a lot of the reason he's like even asked this question now is because he's finally exposing himself to some non-conservative media. I mean, no conservative uh, organization is going to ask, did Donald Trump lose the election, right? But liberal media is actually, so it's like, it's good. He's saying he's finally getting opportunities to sort of engage a little bit, whether it works or not. We'll see. Okay.
Well,
It's been
per
great talking to
usual,
you
there was
guys.
also the dishonesty on the abortion question, where his interlocutor stated very boldly that there are 0 Democrats who support abortion up until birth, when obviously there are many prominent Democrats on the record for that. Oh, before we wrap up, just one housekeeping point. The reason I was on vacation in Poland, Richard was dealing with his book. It just so happened that we didn't record for a couple weeks while Richard got canceled. It has nothing to do with it. So I
Yes,
just got a
Inez
lot
did
of
not
I got
abandon
a lot
you.
of tweets about that. Like, is this show canceled or whatever? No, this was just a coincidence. So
No, the rest of the world might cancel me, but I don't think Inez ever will. All right, great. Then I will see you next week.
I'll see you next week.